you so much for accepting to do this interview. It's such a privilege for me to be able to, just ask you these questions.
It's really my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So my first question is regarding your biography. You are both a mathematician and a philosopher. How do you reconcile those two almost contradictory tendencies in your life and in your scholarship?
Actually, I did not find them contradictory. When I was studying in the final years of my high school, I loved both mathematics and philosophy, especially when I discovered philosophy at the end of high school. So when I first traveled to France to continue my higher education, actually I had 2 letters accepting me in 2 different programs. One letter from Lycée Louis-le-Grand accepting me into the program they know as Hippocagne and Cagne. Basically, that meant pursuing in philosophy and trying to get into École Normale Supérieure, which I eventually did. And the other letter accepting me was a letter from INSA, from Lyon, Institut National des Sciences Appliquées. So had I accepted to go to INSA, I would probably today be an engineer in some kind of applied science. So I decided to go into philosophy. And I was lucky enough to get into École Normale Supérieure to finish my agrégation in philosophy. And then I caught up somehow with my love of mathematics when I pursued studies in a master in algebra, and I did my PhD. I wrote my dissertation in the field of history of mathematics and logic. And so those 2 loves of mine came together nicely, I would say, in the early phase of my career in philosophy.
Does mathematics show up in your reasoning, in your philosophy?
Well, I would like to think that some form of mathematical rigor, I would call it, or analytical reasoning shows up in my work in philosophy. But I have to say my first 2 books, and a few articles I still write are in that very field. So I have never left the field of history of mathematical logic, of algebraic logic, more precisely.
Okay. Well, we are very glad that you decided to go to Lycée Louis-le-Grand because of your production and your influence on our field. Talking again about your biography, your cultural background, and religious background, how do you think that being an African from Senegal and being also, I will assume, a Muslim person have influenced or redefined, have influenced you to redefine and reorient the scholarship on Islam?
Well, at first I must say that in my education and in my early research, obviously my religion, which is Islam, did not play any role. I started writing in the field of algebraic logic, as I said. When I returned to Senegal in the early 1980s, my plan and my goal was to create a strong curriculum in the field of logic, history and philosophy of science in the Department of Philosophy, which I eventually did thanks to the help of my colleagues and also the wonderful students I had in my early years teaching at Cheikh Anta Diop University. But the context of this was the early 1980s, which is the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, and that meant that Islam occupied the front page, starting at that time, of newspapers and news in general, not always for the good reasons. So we thought as a department that it was our responsibility to have a course in the field of Islamic philosophy to remind everyone that there is a strong intellectual and philosophical tradition in Islamic history, which is a tradition of skeptical, analytical, questioning argumentation. And so we decided to create that curriculum. None of us was truly a specialist in terms of having been trained specifically in that field of Islamic philosophy. Among my colleagues, I would say, the closest to having been trained in that field, not because of the schooling and the education I had in my higher education, but mainly because of my family background. I come from a family where there is a strong tradition of scholarship in Islamic studies, and I was raised by a father who sort of got me involved in that type of education. So I could hold the position, hopefully at that time waiting for a true specialist to be hired. The specialist never came, so I had to train myself somehow into the position. And yeah, I was able more and more to fake it, I would say. And I started also writing in that field. So in addition to my writing and research and teaching in the field of philosophy of science and history of logic and mathematics, I was also teaching Islamic philosophy and more writing in that field. So I started developing that field as well.
Okay. So would you say that your book, Common Philosophy and Islam, is like a continuation of this mission you had as a department in Sheikh Anta Diop University?
Absolutely, it is indeed that book is a product and a testimony somehow of the of my teaching in Sheikh Anta Diop University, where I started this kind of curriculum. Also at Northwestern University in Chicago, where I also taught a course in Islamic philosophy, and now at Columbia University, where I'm teaching, and among other courses that I teach for Columbia University, I'm teaching this Islamic philosophy course. So yes, for that book, I have to thank the many students who have taken my course in Senegal, in Chicago, and now at Columbia University.
Okay. So what would you say, would be the geopolitical or epistemological stakes of, like, everyone knowing that there is like this tradition of like skepticism of reasoning in Islam? What would be the stake like for us now to know that?
Well, I believe it's very important for many different reasons. One reason is that actually you cannot truly understand the history of philosophy in general if you do not also understand the history of philosophy in the Islamic world. So if you are a philosopher and you are trained in philosophy and you are trained in the knowledge of the history of philosophy, there would be a gap truly in your philosophical education if you just ignore altogether that history. Let me put it this way. In most of the textbooks from which we learn the history of philosophy, you would have something along the lines of the history of the pre-Socratics, and then, of course, the Socratic moment, and then the post-Socratic moment, the Stoics, Aristotle obviously also being a very important moment, and then the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, and so on. And then from there, you jump to antiquity, medieval Christianity, medieval Latin Christianity, and from there you go to the modern period and contemporary philosophy. That's basically the line that you follow, the path that you follow when you study the history of philosophy and when you read textbooks in philosophy. But this is a oversimplified history of philosophy, because actually you had all the development of Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy and Greek Christian philosophy, not just the Latin Christian philosophy. And if you take the medieval period, for example, you know that Christian theologian and philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas became a saint, was declared saint by the church. But before that, he was at one point condemned as heretic and under the accusation of being an Averroist. That is to say, following the philosophy of some guy named Averroes. So how could you fully understand Thomas Aquinas if you do not make sense of that accusation of Averroism, if you do not know who Averroes was? And in fact, you discover that Averroes is the Latinized name of a philosopher named Ibn Rushd, who lived in southern Spain and whose work was very influential and influenced by also the general history of Islamic philosophy. So you have all these names, these very important names, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, etc., who are part of the history of philosophy, who inherited, appropriated Greek philosophy and truly appropriated it, which means that they went beyond just commenting on it, but being productive on it, passing it to Europe, having conversation with Jewish philosophers such as Maimonides, having conversation with Christian philosophers, and so on and so forth. So you cannot ignore that history if you want to truly understand the history of philosophy. Now, what happened in the way in which we consider mainstream history of philosophy is that sometime at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th century, you had the reconstruction of the history of philosophy as something exclusively European. This was an ideological construction to decide that history of philosophy started with the Greeks, the Greek so-called miracle. A miracle is always convenient because a miracle by definition is not preceded by anything else, okay? And then from the Greek went to Rome, and from Rome to medieval Latin Christian Europe. That simplification happened at that time. Prior to that, in the history of philosophy, philosophers themselves never thought that the discipline actually was exclusively European. The Greeks themselves acknowledged what they own to the Egyptians. Descartes mentioned the importance of algebra, which he recognized as a foreign, that is, Arabic science, for the development of his own philosophy. Leibniz was very open to the rest of the world, to Chinese writing when he was doing logic. So it was not a problem for philosophers in general to acknowledge that the history of philosophy was much, much broader than just its European line. But 19th century decided philosophy must be the exclusive property, somehow, of Europe. So developing an education in Islamic philosophy has first and foremost that function of complicating the history of philosophy, or rather showing how complicated, how complex it is, and the tours and detours that was made by that history. That's on the one hand. Now, on the Islamic side, it is important, especially in the time that we are living in, to remind people a couple of simple truths. First, that Islam is not the religion of a few people who are now being on the front pages of newspapers, but the religion of 1.5 billion people. Second, that Islam was not born on 9/11, was not a religion born yesterday, that it has lasted for almost 1.5 millennium. And during that 1.5 millennium, it has developed as an intellectual and a spiritual tradition. And you could also add an aesthetic tradition. So that intellectual history needs to be known. That spiritual history needs to be known, and needs to be known by the Muslims themselves, who are undergoing, and that is my opinion, who are undergoing some kind of crisis of transmission of their own heritage and some crisis of understanding of their own heritage. So it is the responsibility, I believe, of intellectuals in general to educate people also by just reminding them of what that intellectual and spiritual tradition is.
Okay, thank you. So talking about like this philological approach to those concepts as Islam, and relating it to this thing that I think we must talk about Senghor. L'émotion est nègre, la raison est hélène. You are among the few scholars who have reinterpreted that, that sentence and have put it in a different context and have kind of, excused Senghor of the accusation of playing the colonial game. Could you, just as you did it yesterday, could you just, in a few words, retrace your amazing, reconstitutionalization of this sentence?
Well, actually, what I did with Senghor, the kind of rereading of Senghor against these too quick and dismissive accusations of essentialism. What I did actually was just simply read him. In other words, people have been dismissive of Senghor on the basis mainly of that infamous formula, l'émotion est nègre comme la raison est hélène. And people seem to think that this is the first and last word of Senghor thought, which is absurd. What I've done is recontextualize actually that formula and remind people that this was written in 1939. And Senghor had 50 more years of writing where he himself revisited, explained, contradicted, rectified that formula. So one has just to read Negritude, Senghor's philosophy, as a development and not just flatten it on one single formula. That was from one thing. Second thing, I paid attention to the context. What was Senghor talking about in the very essay of 1939 entitled What the Black Man Contributes, Ce que l'homme noir apporte? What was he talking about? He was mainly talking about African art. He had been reading just then an important book, a book that would be very important for him, a book on art nègre, as it was called, African art, written by Monroe and Guillaume, two art collectors, and entitled in English Primitive Negro Sculpture, and was translated during those years into French under the title La Sculpture Nègre, I believe. And so the reflection that Senghor had at that time was a contrast between Greco-Roman statuary and the aesthetics of idealizing reality, taking reality as it is, reproducing it in an idealized way. And he was contrasting that with the way in which African sculpture is not about reproducing reality, but trying to capture behind the appearance what Senghor called the sub-reality of the thing. And the idea that the artist was looking for the sub-reality beneath the surface of things, which would explain why he was not, the artist, he or she was not pursuing the reproduction of reality, but on the contrary, combining forms, different forms, geometrical forms, exaggerating this feature of the human figure versus this other feature, etc. Senghor asked the question, what are they after? So it was not the goal of reproducing some kind of erotic relationship to the object through reproduction of the reality, but what he considered to be like a blow, and the shock that the object is supposed to produce because one enters a contact, is in direct contact with something he called a force, the ordering force that was represented by the artist. And he called that emotion. So within the context of his reflection, if you translate the formula he had, you would understand that what he was saying is that emotion, aesthetic emotion, is to the productions of African art what reason, analytical reason, is to the production of Greco-Roman art. And if you translate the formula that way, taking into account the context in which he was writing, then you understand that formula in a much, much less scandalous way as the way in which it has been understood. People pretended that Senghor said that black people only have emotion, while white people would be reasonable and rational, etc. He never said that. He never said that. He was too much of a Bergsonian philosopher to say something like that. Because when Bergson, the philosopher Bergson, who was very influential on Senghor thought, himself contrasted analytical approach to reality and intuitive approach to reality, he was not saying that humanity is divided into people who are analytical and people who are intuitive. He was saying that these are the two depths of the human cognitive capacity.
Excellent. That's such a, it's so nice to hear that, because, it's so revitalizing for, of a negritude, and like for us who are like studying, these supposedly dead concepts, because, it's never going to come again. It's very fixed in the space and time. So thank you so much for, again, refreshing this, the scholarship on this side. Then this is going to be my last question. Yesterday on your talk about Senghor again and negritude, and you mentioned you kind of redefine negritude in terms of not this fixed concept in time and space, but something which is very dynamic, something which is, there is more to come, there is something, which is more global actually. And that reminded me of the Glissantian terms of, concept of créolisation. Yeah. Would you say that it is about the same, or do you see a difference between it?
Well, indeed. I think that if we take negritude seriously, that is to say, if we read the whole unfolding of negritude, we also get that idea that, of course, yes, the essentialist language is there. This is not something to be ignored. But so is the language of fluidity, so is the language of mixture, so is the language of becoming. Toward the end of his life, and this is something I reminded everybody at the lecture I gave yesterday, toward the end of his life, in the letters he exchanged with Jeannette Vaillant, his American biographer, Senghor acknowledged that his own thought had developed through many different contradictions. And as he was saying at the time in the letter he wrote to Janet, it is only towards the end that one was able to see how these contradictions converge into some form of symbiosis. And he also said in the letters he exchanged with Janet Vaillant that negritude should not be considered an essence, but an existence. And he added, in the Sartrean sense of it, or in the Teilhard de Chardin way of understanding a phenomenon, which means that he was conscious that negritude was some kind of open-ended existence. And that was very important. If you start reading the whole movement as a movement from that perspective, then you can see how the texts written by Senghor are much more complicated. Very recently, actually a few months ago, the posthumous writings of Senghor were published. Lectures he gave, speeches he gave after the 1970s. They were published together under the title Éducation et Culture. And in fact, this volume would have been the Liberté 6 volume of the series. As you know, Senghor has gathered all his essays and speeches and writings into these volumes, Liberté 1, from Liberté 1 to Liberté 5. And this posthumous volume would have been Liberté 6. And it is interesting and important to look at the evolution of his thinking throughout these volumes and have a sense of the movement of his thought and not just petrified. We have had until now a reading of Senghor which actually petrifies it and reified it. So we are looking at a philosophy as being essentialist while not realizing that it is our own reading which is essentializing. And somehow it is Sartre, right at the beginning in 1948, who is guilty of that reification and that essentialization of negritude, which is ironic because he is the philosopher of existence.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're
such a pleasure, welcome. Such a privilege to hear these words from such a renowned scholar as yourself.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation.